Yes, it's that time of the year again. Russian President Vladimir Putin's annual address to the Federal Assembly. Putin has been in power for 20 years, so it's natural that there are questions about his political achievements and his future. So what has he been saying? How does this year look for Russian foreign policy? What should Russia and the world expect as Putin's rule reaches 20 years? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Hongjian, Director of the Department for European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies, and Varvara Kostenbruk, a Russian journalist. We shall also speak via satellite to Professor Joe Toka at American Graduate School of International Affairs and Diplomacy in Paris, and to Pavel Fagonhor, Russian defense analyst in Moscow. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to our discussion here. First of all, what do you think are the most interesting points in his presentation, the annual one that he gave to the Russian Duma? Hongjian.
I think firstly, Mr. Putin will try to focus on especially some domestic affairs, including economy. As we know, recent years, economy and how to promote the living standard for people become a very, very priority for Mr. Putin and his government. Because as we know now, the big problem now for Russia is how to have a sustainable economy and to support some ambition of Mr. Putin and his government. As we know now already, the size of the economy of the United States has been 13.5 times bigger than Russian economy. So if we look at, okay, there will be some competition between Russia and the United States on some global issue, some security issue. But another very big question is how could Russia do something more for development, for economic development, and to support this kind of a competition. And of course, another, I think, a very, very big focus would be the foreign affairs and also military affairs. Always, as we know, there's some highlights for Mr. Putin and his government in recent years to win some more popularity and also support from the average people in Russia. So indeed, I think domestic affairs, international affairs, and how could Mr. Putin to give some more perspective on his government and also his policy. Very, very highlight focus.
Yes, indeed, for centuries, Russia is known for being able to play diplomacy as a big power, either in Europe or across the Euro-Asian continent. China was both victim and beneficiary in the game, so to speak. But Valia, what do you think are the major interesting points each year in his annual address to the Russian Duma? And this year, what do you think should be the top priorities?
Of course, top priorities should be people, because country, the people. And I think it was very wise of Vladimir Putin to start from such issues like population decrease and support of families, and especially families who have more than 1 or 2 kids. Because if we don't support them now, in some tens of years, there will be no one to support the country.
That's indeed a very embarrassing story about the demographic changes in the society and the social landscape of Russia. Let me go back to our old friend Pavel Fagonhor for his comments on the presentation that Putin delivered to the Russian Duma. Hello, Pavel. What has impressed you most about his speech?
Well, Putin was talking about, basically, as always, about the threats to Russia, but foreign threats were just kind of, mentioned that they are and that they're serious, but the Russian response should be a unification of the nation and solving internal problems, and foremost it would be the demographic crisis that's looming right now, with a possible almost 10% decrease of the population in 10 years, and also with poverty, which is also connected to depopulation, because the families which have 2 kids or even more are quite often the most impoverished. So there's going to be increased government spending on that. And there's going to be also streamlining of the Russian constitution, some changes in how government is run, at least formally, the formalities of it, which are right now are not as relevant as in the 90s, giving more power to parliament. But basically, of course, parliament is controlled fully by the Kremlin, so that will not, it will change the letter of the constitution, but not the substance of power inside Russia.
Thank you very much, Pavel. Let me cross over to Juv Polka. Juv Polka, can I have your comments on why we have this embarrassing birth rate for Russians? I mean, it's even worse. The story about the demographic change in Russia is even worse than during the Second World War. Russians, and particularly President Putin, do have good reasons to be worried. Do you think this is an irreversible decline in the population growth? Or with the strong financial support, we're going to see some silver lining in the darkest clouds?
Well, as far as I understand, and regarding the reliability of very latest figures regarding Russian demography, well, things are moving somehow better over the last 2 to 3 years. This is not enough, of course, to make sure there is stability and promising stability in this domain, which is so crucial, as the colleague in the studio in Beijing just emphasized 2 minutes ago. But it is going in the right direction. Don't forget that the Russians have to compensate, so to speak, not only in population and demography in terms of birth, but also in terms of what happened 25, 30 years ago, namely the fact that the USSR, the Soviet Union, disappeared and became Russia, and of course shrank down in terms of so many terms, but also in terms of demography. But I would say that on a general level, the major challenge of President Putin, who is now in power for 20 years, exceptionally long, when we're speaking about superpowers such as Russia, the major challenge would be to preserve his capacity to project power, which indeed is weaker than the objective power Russia really has. This is a very delicate exercise and a very sophisticated one. And my appreciation is that he's doing it very well, excellently well. Will he be able to go on this way on the international scene?
Today, Russia boasts of a population of 147 million people, and this number is declining sharply. Let me go back to Pavel. It seems Russia is threatened by 2 curses. One is, of course, the aging population. The other, ironically, is there is the ongoing outbound flow of people, young people in particular. Many of them choose to live abroad. They don't want to live in Russia. Now, if this is true, can you brief us on the reasons behind the underperformance of the kids, the young people? Why don't they love their country? Is that because of the process of globalization, impact of Western values, your integration with Europe, or decline in the Russian economy? What are the reasons behind the poor attitude of young Russians?
The Russian economy has been stagnating already for about 7 years. The household incomes have been actually decreasing, not dramatically, but still at least not growing, and that's a sure thing. And this is creating internal social tensions. And yes, young professionals with good education tend to leave the country and pursue careers in the West, in the global economy. This is not really a demographic factor. The number of the young professionals leaving demographically, it's not very significant, but it's very significant for the country's potential. There are the same things in many other countries, non-Western, in India and China, where young professionals, well trained, seek careers outside of the country. Putin wants to address that by making, say, government service, and government service in Russia is seen as, by those who stay, as maybe the best possible career, will be only open to those who kind of stay in Russia and don't have a foreign passport or a foreign permanent residence permit. That's going to be addressed. It's going to, of course, economic growth should step in. Putin was talking about increasing investment, economic growth, which will make everything better.
Thank you very much, Pavel.
Is that achievable? No one knows for sure.
Yeah, we are talking about deliverables of his economic policy. Now, other than the issue of demographic changes in Russia, well, Valeria, why do you think people above the age of 30 would speak of Putin positively? Because they would describe the economic underperformance as a matter of stability. But the people below the age of 30 would think this is a lackluster performance, this is an underperformance. They show apparent signs of dissatisfaction with the Putin administration. Why do we have this sort of a division in this spectrum of public opinions?
I think it can be explained by the reason where they live. If they live abroad, of course they are under some public opinion abroad, under this influence. And also, younger generation is being raised more under, let's say, westernized values. Not so much like the older generation, which were growing up in the environment of Soviet values. Of course, they not usually consider what we have now through the angle what we had before, and then they could appreciate what we have now. But then if you compare yourself with a very, very developed countries, then you see that you are behind, then you are looking for someone to blame, right?
The steady approval rating of President Putin must be the envy of many Western politicians, because he enjoys the steady approval rating of around at least 60%. At the highest, it could be 80% in the immediate aftermath of his previous elections. Is it true that by the creation of external threats, he is able to align as many Russians as possible behind him, saying, hey, you know, Russia will be invaded. We have the biggest threats, security-wise, from Europe and from the United States, so that, you know, this what we call process of self-fulfilling prophecy could come true. And the morale could be shot up, and I mean, the supporting rate for President Putin would be seriously promoted as a result of this creation of enemy.
Within the country, this international situation is not that much important for people. Mm-hmm. For people within the country who supporting Vladimir Putin, what's important is economy and some help from the government, like financial help for the families,
particularly for the retirees, the pensioners.
Exactly, and now we have a lot of retirees considering that the population decrease. And as I know, even people in their 50s and 40s, they mostly support him because of his role in the international scene.
You know, Mikhail Gorbachev, the last president of the Soviet Union, imposed a comprehensive ban on alcoholics, particularly the use of vodka. Mm-hmm. And for that, part of that contributed to his being ousted from Kremlin, other than, you know, other fundamental, deep-rooted structural problems that the former Soviet Union was facing. So what's going on with vodka? Because that negative impact upon Russian males would lead to their sleeping rough in the streets, and that could kill them. Mm-hmm. Hence, one of the major reasons behind the short lifespan of the Russian population. Is that still the case?
I don't think now it's such a big case as before. First of all, because the situation got much better than right after Soviet crash, and mainly people were applying to vodka because of the life stress, life pressure, and they didn't see the chances to live well. Now that seems there are more opportunities, so let's say population getting a bit healthier.
We would encourage Russians, particularly gentlemen, to drink more of a Maltai from China. It would be less of a killer liquor. It's kind of a joke. So Hong Jian, what do you think are the major economic issues for Russia? We were talking always about the not very healthy structural issues like excessive reliance on the export of energy. For example, in the next 30 years, according to Xinhua News Agency, a recent contract on energy cooperation between Russia and China would generate up to $400 billion for Moscow. And that's a lot. That is a lot. And also Germany is talking about the Nord Stream 2 project to import more of the Russian gas through a pipe that has caused a lot of anger from Washington. So what do you think of this alleged obsession by the Russians with the energy? It seems energy alone could help much of the economic problems and the issues of livelihoods for ordinary folks.
Yes, always. I think this we call it a kind of energy curse. Always, bigger problem.
Resource curse.
Yeah, resource curse. Always a big problem for Russia. And also we can find that the very big efforts made by Mr. Putin try to change this kind of economic structure. And also he called a kind of even a reform of this structure, and to have some more comprehensive, economic sectors, including the manufacturing infrastructure and something else. Another, I think, a very big issue for Russian economy is what will be a major market. In the tradition, of course, Europe will be a very, very, important market for Russia. But now, in the background of the sanctions imposed by European Union and the United States, it looks like more and more, further and further. Russia is trying to get some more, cooperation with China, with Asia and the Pacific market. So I think always very big, difficult for the choice. Firstly, how could it try for Russia to develop its comprehensive economic structure from energy, and also then how could Russia to, keep a balance between the European market and the Asian market. So I think now always once Russia will do something more in economy and also this reform, certainly I think a more favorable international environment will be required by Russia.
Look, here is yet another chronic issue with the Russians. Not only elites, but many of the ordinary folks in Russia would think mentally, psychologically, they are European, more European than Asian. Although Russia is basically a Euro-Asian continental power. Having said this, is it very much an embarrassment for President Putin and his policymakers, Pavel, that policy of engagement with China economically and strategically is more of a kind of expediency, because Europeans, Russia in the European part would always decide their future, would always shape their policy orientation and their national pride. Is that still the case?
Well, Russia has traditionally seen itself since, the Tsar Peter the Great, and maybe even before, as primarily a European Western nation, and westernization of Russian society has been the main drive of many governments, communist and non-communist, and is still very much the case today. But the building of better relations with China is not just simply because we've been rejected by Europe. It's Putin had been decisively building bridges to China and to the East. Even before Russia went into this serious crisis in 2014 with the West. This is a deliberate choice for Russia to have very good relations, the best possible relations with China. This does not exclude having good relations with Europe. There's still yet hope that, that Europe may kind of turn more to Russia and less to the United States, which was becoming recently so arrogant in foreign policy, because that would be the Russian kind of dream, to be a golden bridge between the East and the West, between Europe and China and the Far East. But of course that's not yet really on the cards, but still there's hope that such a project in the future may materialize, and Putin was talking about that too.
Let me cross over to Zhivtoga. Is it true that Europe is losing Russia to China? Europe is losing Russia to the East. Look at the recent visit by Chancellor Angela Merkel to Moscow, talking about energy cooperation as well as increasing market shares for Russian products, so that the negative impact of the going east strategy of Moscow will be seriously mitigated, will be compromised. What do you think of the German policy? Does that represent a common sense of Brussels?
I don't know whether I'd use the formula of Europe, globally speaking, losing Russia to China as an overall formula. But here are some of the points we've already covered in this conversation and some other ones, right? I agree with our colleague in Moscow that a dilemma, that existential dilemma of Russia history, are we Europeans rather, or are we Asians rather, has gotten a different interpretation over the last generation or two. Indeed, Russia has been Westernly minded and oriented for a long time until these recent decades. But this is not just a Russian process. This is also due to the fact, and this is where it comes to your question, this is due to the fact that throughout centuries, Europe indeed was the center of the world, and this is where most powers actually reside. This is not anymore the case, and one could argue that Asia is today, if not the center of the world, then more and more the center of the world. So Russian further interest in Asian partnerships and cooperation, mainly with China, but also with Japan and other Asian powers, is in a way tuned to what is happening geostrategically around the planet. Now, you have to add, of course, to that the fact that Russia has never had such bad relationships with European powers. Let it be with the European Union, let it be because of the Crimean crisis and the sanctions, let it be because of the fears of practically every single European country, small, medium, or big, regarding Russian intentions. Look at the way the Scandinavians are crispy regarding Russian intentions, not to speak about the Baltic countries. Look at Poland, look at the very delicate relations with Germany, with France, with Italy. The only major exception in that context is, of course, Turkey, which is not a member of the European Union, but which is an important European power. And here, Russian-Turkish relations are enjoying a very interesting, although still enigmatic, sort of push-up.
Thank you very much. Let me go back to Pavel very quickly. You spoke of the amendment to Russian constitution in his presentation to the Duma. Now, Pavel, half a year ago, I went to Irkutsk to visit a local museum that enshrined the legacy of Decembrists, which told a story about the group of Russian officers who, after the 1812 victory against Napoleon Bonaparte, visited Paris and drew inspirations about democracy. And you were talking about the balance of power between Duma and the presidency of Putin. To what degree do you think this kind of a soul of the Russian spirit still lies in this underdeveloped part of the Far East Siberia, despite the all the signs of policy orientation about, being a wedge against, sort of, or hedge against the American hegemony militarily and geopolitically between Beijing and Moscow. So we are talking about some important part of your national character and thoughts that have shaped Russian politics, which are also known for being the third Rome and Messiah. What can you tell us? This is a big story, but I want to be briefed about what Russia really wants.
Well, Putin was very straightforward about saying that there are very grave outside threats to Russia, the threats that should have been foreseen but were not foreseen, that there are internal problems, and consolidation is the main issue. And of course, he was talking about that there's the changes in the Constitution. Actually, in the practical sense, apparently he was saying that he will not be going for re-election in 24, which is a really big issue. That there's going to be a top of only 2 times president, and that means he's already exhausted all that possibility. The change of balance of power between the Duma and the Kremlin is not so important because the Kremlin controls absolute majority in the Duma. So Russia, Putin sees outside threats to Russia coming from the West, primarily from the United States. A partnership with China is very important in that situation, kind of standing side to side or back to back in Eurasia. And actually those the decabristi that tried an unsuccessful coup in 1825 are already not seen as great big heroes today in today's Russia, but more as troublemakers, pro-Western.
But President Trump has been invited by his Russian counterpart to attend a ceremony in commemoration of their defeat of Nazi Germany at the end of the Second World War. President Trump has delivered a very ambiguous message about whether he would accept the invitation or not. But as part of the conclusion of this very interesting discussion, Valeria, what do you think of the presidency of Mr. Putin? Will he seek to win yet another term, which will last for 6 years, right? By the year 2024, is he likely to be involved yet in another general election?
I think that it's 90% that we will see him again because of the major support. And even if not, I guess there will be someone like Dmitry Medvedev to get the...
We see the implications of the double-head eagle as a national symbol of Russia. Hong Jian, what are your thoughts about the presidency of Mr. Putin?
I think to a very large degree, Mr. Putin is very successful as a leader in Russia, especially so big power, big countries. But now I think also another big question is how about the period after Mr. Putin? So I think now already it's a time to raise this question, because not only the issue for stability and also the development of Russia, and especially if we take account more about some very big challenge for Russia, including the demographic issues, some other. So I think a long-term stable, politics, and also maybe a gentleman or a lady, Mr. Putin will be also required by the Russian politics.
Thank you very much. Recently, a joint naval drill was hosted between Russia, China, and Iran. Many people around the world are watching out as to what message the drill actually delivered. We'll keep this question open for more of our discussions on geopolitics next time. Until then, goodbye.